Great to have you along for the ride. Thanks a lot for stopping by. Really glad to have this guy on. He's an author. He's a journalist. He's the creator of Ancient Apocalypse, which is on Netflix right now. It's Graham Hancock. Graham, how are you? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Joe.
You
Thanks for having me on your show.
You're very welcome. Kay acquainted us, our mutual friend Kay Smythe, and I think she's right. I think that you've got a very cool accent. Now, she said it was cooler than hers, which I'm not sure yet. We'll talk for a while. Maybe I'll make that decision, but it's...
Well, since I'm 72 years old now, maybe I've had longer to practice.
That could be it. Exactly right. Now, I have not seen Ancient Apocalypse yet, but we sort of did a preview yesterday when I had Kay on the program. And the preview really grabbed my attention because I remember going to school in this country. I was in public school my entire career, and I learned that human beings showed up 10,000 years ago, which it turns out really isn't the case. In fact, your premise is that there were humans not only around, but there were civilizations thousands of years ago that were pretty modern by today's standards. Fill me in.
I think it's a possibility that has to be considered. The Ice Age was a very dramatic, very peculiar period, set in about 125,000 years ago, came to an end cataclysmically around 12,000 years ago. There are many anomalies and puzzles that come down to us from the Ice Age. Somebody was mapping the Ice Age world, and they were doing so with great accuracy, with accurate relative longitudes, which is a considerable technological feat that our civilization didn't achieve until the middle of the 18th century.
Right.
Somebody was making very accurate astronomical observations and geometrical measurements. So it's like a black hole in the past. There's my sense is of something missing, and somebody needs to speak to that. And I spent the last 30 years in a series of books and television series trying to address this point of view, which is completely the opposite of anything that mainstream archaeologists believe. It's the opposite of what they teach. It's a minority point of view, but it's a point of view that I believe deserves consideration.
I want to do more of a dive into that. Go to GrahamHancock.com. GrahamHancock.com is his website. Again, check out on Netflix Ancient Apocalypse. I don't get it. We were mapping things out and following the Ice Age, and Kay mentioned yesterday international travel 10 or 12,000 years ago. What sort of evidence are we seeing of that?
Well, for example, the DNA evidence. There's a group of people called the Surui in the Amazon rainforest in South America who carry genes that are closely related to those of people from Melanesia and Papua New Guinea. And the earliest surviving evidence for the presence of these genes in South America goes back to the last Ice Age, nearly 12,000 years ago. Wow. So somebody 12,000 years ago was capable of carrying genetic material, in other words, of reproducing across vast distances of the Pacific Ocean, connecting Melanesia, Papua New Guinea with South America. That's hard genetic evidence. Nobody disputes that it's there. The mystery is how it got there. If the only peopling of the Americas came across the Bering Straits through North America and down into South America, we should find this gene in North America, but we do not. We only find it in the Amazon rainforest and in Melanesia, right across on the other side of the Pacific Ocean.
It's incredibly interesting because we, of course, are educated to believe that those that we call indigenous people here in this land that we now call the United States, they came through the Bering Straits, as you said. They're either Asian, Eurasian, or European in genetics and DNA code. You're saying that they could have come from the south or from the side?
I'm saying that they probably came lots of different routes. There's no doubt that there was migration across the Bering Straits. Alaska and what is now Russia were once joined in a land bridge when sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today. No doubt there was migration across the Bering Strait, but it wasn't the only way. People came by boats. They coasted along the coastlines. But what's most remarkable is this DNA signal in South America, which speaks to a voyage across the whole of the Pacific Ocean.
Wow.
More than 12,000 years ago. And that is not supposed to have been within the capacities of our ancestors at our time. And this is just one example of what I mean by there's something missing in our past. There's a forgotten episode. I won't swear that it was a civilization that had cell phones or flew spaceships to the moon,
right.
But it was a lot more advanced than the kind of peoples that are generally believed to have lived at that time, and was capable of feats that in some cases we ourselves are only becoming capable of again now.
And the thing is, as a journalist, it's Graham Hancock, by the way. Graham Hancock, he's the creator of Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix. And go to grahamhancock.com, find out more about him. As a journalist, I know that you're skeptical. Again, I talked to our mutual friend about this, and she was quicker to believe this than even you are, or that you were. What was it that told you, well, this must be true? Because, again, I sharpened my teeth in journalism myself. I've won a bunch of awards, and you're extremely skeptical when you're trying to find out the truth. Was there something that hit you in the face and said, well, this has to be?
Well, the first thing I'm skeptical of is archaeology itself.
Yeah.
Because archaeologists are the gatekeepers of our past. They're the people to whom our past is entrusted, and that becomes particularly so when we go into prehistory, before there's any written documents. When no written documents have survived, then it only becomes a matter of interpretation. And I find that archaeologists make a very limited, very cautious interpretation of the past, and are absolutely unwilling to consider other possibilities. And the evidence for a lost civilization of the Ice Age, a civilization that spanned the world, that left maps of its progress, that understood obscure astronomical phenomena like precession of the equinoxes. I've presented this in a series of half a dozen books over the last 30 years, Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, most recently America Before, looking at the whole story of the peopling of the Americas and how that ties into the origins of this lost civilization. It's a life's work for me, and what I've tried to do in this Netflix series is summarize some of the key aspects of it.
Well, Graham, I've got to ask you, why would archaeologists have a problem when you're presenting real facts? Why do they need me to believe their version of it, and why aren't they open to hearing what you're uncovering?
There's a terrible problem of political correctness occurring in the archaeological world at the moment. Because I've proposed the possibility of a lost civilization of the Ice Age, which may have had an influence on other later cultures, I've been accused of being a racist and a white supremacist. I find this personally very injurious, since I'm married to a woman of color, since I have 4 mixed-race children, and since I have 7 mixed-race grandchildren. I find it infuriating to be accused of spreading racism and white supremacy, but it's just a very easy way for archaeologists to put down an opposing argument without actually having to get to grips with the argument.
Yeah, but yours doesn't appear to be opposing, Graham. I'm confused. It appears to be.
Oh, it's opposing because
here's the fact. Well, it opposes what they want us to believe. I get that, but it doesn't oppose fact. They had fact. You found new fact. Put them together. Let's figure out where the hell we all came from. Why is that difficult?
This is where we come to the places who decides what's a fact. You know, who decides what's a fact, and who decides what the fact are the gatekeepers of our past, namely archaeologists. I mean, I regard it as a fact that the erosion on the body of the Great Sphinx speaks to that monument having stood there more than 12,000 years ago.
Yes.
Work of John Anthony West and Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University. I regard it as a fact that the Great Sphinx was oriented to point at the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox 12,800 years ago, facing then the constellation of Leo. I regard it as a fact that the Great Pyramid of Giza incorporates on a scale of 1 to 43,200 the key dimensions of the Earth. The height of the Great Pyramid matches the polar radius of the Earth, and the perimeter of the Great Pyramid matches the equatorial circumference of the Earth. But all of these facts are either dismissed as coincidences or irrelevant or not facts by archaeologists. And it's archaeologists who are controlling the narrative in this space. And that's why they're so furious that I was able to present an alternative point of view, Ancient Apocalypse, on a major platform like Netflix.
Netflix is where you could find it. Ancient Apocalypse is the name of the series. Go and find it right now. GrahamHancock.com is his website. It's Graham Hancock. Let me, again, I'm a simpleton, which you probably have deduced. So when we're talking about the pyramids and the Sphinx,
we should never put ourselves down, Joe.
Well, I'm being a little facetious because I want you to feel welcomed. When we talk about the pyramids and the Sphinx, how could they possibly have made those incredible feats of architecture without something we would call modernity, without some sort of modern abilities that we never gave them credit for? I mean, what is the archaeologist's version of the Sphinx and why it does what it does and how the pyramids were made? And what do you believe the facts show?
The archaeologist's version of the Sphinx is that it was created around 2,500 BC, let's say 4,500 years ago.
Right.
By a pharaoh named Khafre, who modeled its head in his own image. and a pyramid which is attributed to Khafre stands nearby. What the geology of the Sphinx says, and again, there's years of work by others, not just myself, but by Professor Robert Schoch at Boston University and John Anthony West have gone into this. What the geology of the Sphinx says is that that monument stood there during a period of extremely heavy rains, and a period that lasted for more than 1,000 years.
Wow.
The last time there were rains on that level in Egypt was around 12,000 years ago. The astronomy of the Sphinx speaks to an alignment made around 12,000 years ago. The megalithic temples in front of the Sphinx, the so-called Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple, have huge core limestone blocks with later granite blocks that have been added onto them, almost worshipping them, the granite blocks cut in the shape of the erosion on the core limestone blocks. And Egyptologists date the structure to those granite blocks. I and my colleagues see those granite blocks as later restorations of much older, much more ancient structures. But the argument was, how could the Sphinx possibly be 12,000 years old? There's no other structure anywhere in the world on that scale of that age. That was the argument that Egyptologists put forth until the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a gigantic megalithic site with precise astronomical orientations, pillars that weigh 20 tons, which is dated to 11,600 years ago. So if you can make Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years ago, you can make the Sphinx at around the same time.
Amazing.
We're missing something in our history. There's something missing. This is the point that I keep trying to drive home. And no matter how much the archaeologists insult me or attempt to divert the argument or create straw men about what I'm saying, I'd say, first of all, go read my books. And secondly, I'm going to persist in this because we are missing something in our past and attention needs to be paid to it if we're ever to figure out who we really are.
And what's wrong with that? And I've got to tell you, I'm very good at my job. And my job is to take in information and then decide which side I believe and where I want to opine. And then I'm willing to take on debate with somebody who's on the other side. I'm yet to hear you allude to anything that would have to do with skin tone or ancestry. I'm not sure I understand how there's a white supremacist straw man being thrown at you when you're talking about Egypt and you're talking about people coming through the Bering Straits, from parts of Asia and so on, or maybe making a Pacific Ocean trip that nobody ever thought could happen, which would be an unbelievable feat should we just study it above board. What is their argument? Where does the white supremacy come in, Graham? I'm missing it.
The most recent book, which is published in 2019, America Before, The Key to Earth's Lost Civilization, I present evidence and suggest that the origins of this lost civilization were Native American, that it was based in the Americas. These accusations of racism and white supremacy have been thrown at me purely to divert the argument from the issues about which I'm talking, and turn it into some sort of fantasy witch hunt. And I think the purpose is to discourage people from watching the show and discourage people from reading my books. But I think people are more discerning than that and will make up their own mind.
Well, I think that people in this day and age genuflect to, I'm not a racist, and they have to immediately change whatever the course is that they're on. Has Netflix flinched at all? Have they bent a knee at all to these people or not?
Netflix have not flinched, as far as I'm aware. We thoroughly fact-checked everything in this series. We were extremely careful about all of that. Every factual statement was triple fact-checked. Good. And we're satisfied with the accuracy and the honesty of what we presented. But I think archaeology just finds it a very bitter pill to swallow. But it needs to be remembered that archaeology dominates all teaching about history in schools, about prehistory. It's all based on archaeology. The mainstream media, when they speak about the past, are speaking about a past drawn from the ideas of mainstream archaeologists. I'm just one voice offering an alternative point of view, yet it's made them so angry that this one voice got on a major channel.
His name is Graham Hancock. Go to grahamhancock.com. He's an author. He's a journalist, creator of Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix right now. Let me ask you about the term Ice Age. You said it quite a few times, and the Ice Age was the cataclysmic event, I suppose, that took us out of the modern times and made us go and hunt and gather again, and maybe we had a great reset. But when I hear Ice Age, of course, you think about an animated series that Disney put out or something. What specific? If I said, what is the Ice Age, what would you say?
The world has gone through a series of extraordinary climatic changes. There was one called the Eemian before the last ice age, when temperatures were even warmer than they are today. That was prior to about 120,000 years ago. Then a kind of deep freeze set in. Nobody's ever fully or satisfactorily explained why. and the northern continents and indeed the whole world became encased in ice. But it was particularly North America. You had ice sheets that were 2 miles deep,
Wow.
covering almost all of North America, north of roughly, Minnesota, and ice sheets 2 miles deep, covering most of northern Europe and extending into Siberia. You had extensive ice sheets in the southern hemisphere as well. Antarctica was bigger than it is today. As a result of all this water caught up in ice caps on top of the continental land masses, sea levels were lower. Sea level was 400 feet lower at the peak of the Ice Age 21,000 years ago than it is today. That's an enormous change.
Stunning.
When the Ice Age melted down, that was when the cataclysm happened, between roughly 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. Dramatic climate shifts occurred. The sea levels rose very rapidly. And that huge landmass that had been above water was swallowed up by the sea. I'm not saying it all happened between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, but a lot of it did. What we've lost at the end of the day, I'll put it in plain math, is 10 million square miles of the best real estate on Earth was swallowed up by those rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. So if anybody says that the story of a global deluge or a global flood is not true, I draw their attention to Meltwater Pulse 1b 11,600 years ago at the end of the ice age and the enormous rise in sea levels that it caused. So the ice age was a very puzzling period. We don't know why it got so cold, but we have a pretty good idea why it ended so suddenly. And that's the idea which I report in Ancient Apocalypse, and it's why it's called Ancient Apocalypse. And this is a hypothesis. It's called the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. It's not the work of Graham Hancock. It's the work of about 100 mainstream scientists who nevertheless have been sidelined by their colleagues. These are all top people in their field. And their proposal since 2007, elaborated now in just hundreds of scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals, but hardly paid attention to by anybody. Their proposal is that the Earth passed through the debris stream of a disintegrating comet.
Wow.
12,800 years ago. That comet was originally a giant comet. It wandered into the inner solar system about 20,000 years ago, and it began to break up into multiple fragments, just like Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 broke up into multiple fragments before it hit Jupiter in 1994. Those fragments then spread out into a debris trail that was tens of millions of kilometers wide, and around 12,800 years ago, the Earth crossed the orbit of this debris trail, and we received not just one impact, but a swarm of impacts from comet fragments, some of which may have been a kilometer in diameter, others of which may have been fist-sized in diameter. But they hit the Earth. The debris trail has been traced very clearly from the western coast of North America right across to Syria, a site called Abu Huraira in Syria, right down south into Chile, even into Antarctica and over into Greenland. The debris trail has been traced in all of these places, and there's a lot of opposition to this hypothesis, but the evidence is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And we show a layer in the Earth called the Younger Dryas boundary layer, which is full of nanodiamonds and melted quartz, which are the products of the giant impact and heat created by these objects colliding with the Earth.
Unbelievable. I mean, these are things that we had never even gotten wind of whatsoever. And again, I'm still having a bit of trouble why archaeologists would not be happy with us uncovering more of our history as human beings. I don't get why they're so, I guess, arrogant and firm in their ways that they want to be the ones who tell us what's real and what's not. So attack anybody who does real research and real journalism.
I think, by and large, archaeologists are very sincere in what they do. Okay. And I don't think that I could do anything that I do if it wasn't for the good hard groundwork done by archaeologists. But archaeologists are bound in a way that I am not by a paradigm, a narrative about the story of our past, about how civilizations first emerged about 6,000 years ago, about how we went through the Neolithic period before that, the Upper Paleolithic period before that. There's a whole timeline of the origins of civilization that careers are invested in all around the world, that's taught in schools and universities all around the world. And what I'm suggesting is that is a house of cards built on a foundation of sand, because missing from the timeline is a story of a civilization that existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed in the cataclysms at the end of the Ice Age. And I emphasize, I'm not saying a vastly technological civilization, but a civilization that was more than hunter-gatherers, a civilization that was exploring the Earth, that had navigation technology, that could get all around the world, that could map the Earth, that could show Antarctica. We have ancient maps from the 15 and 1600s where the map makers tell us that they copied the map from older source maps that were falling to pieces.
Wow.
Those older source maps no longer exist. For example, the Piri-Reis map drawn in 1513. These maps show Antarctica. The Orontius Phineas world map drawn in 1534 shows Antarctica 300 years before our civilization discovered Antarctica. And the reason that Antarctica is shown on those maps, we didn't find it until 1818. The reason that Antarctica is shown on those maps is the older source maps from which they draw. Maps, as the great author Charles Hapgood once said, maps of the ancient sea kings, maps of a culture that mapped the Earth during the last ice age.
Unbelievable. I mean, you never would have expected that. I mean, to be able to have any sort of an idea of geography before I think of geography, which would be in the 1600s, is amazing to me. So let me ask you a question that I think is a pretty simple one. The Ice Age comes. Most of the globe is encased in ice, some of it miles and miles thick. How do human beings survive that? And how did we come to thrive like we are today?
Well, they head to the best real estate on Earth. They head down towards the coastlines. They head down towards the more tropical zones.
So they all gather around the equator then?
Yeah, closer to the equator. When we look at the Indonesian islands today, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, the Malaysian peninsula, these are all separate land masses today. But during the Ice Age, they were a vast connected land mass, a subcontinent-sized land mass which we geologists call Sundaland. Okay. And there was a beautiful migration route down from there into the southern part of what is now Indonesia, into Java. And there, in fact, in the first episode of the series, we have an extraordinary monument at a place called Gunung Padang, a pyramid that seems to work on which appears to have begun some 24,000 years ago, which is 20,000 years older than the approximate date given for the Great Pyramids of Egypt.
Wow. I mean, it's stunning. I mean, you would imagine you'd have to go where it's warmer. So as the ice starts to melt over the thousands of years, people gradually migrated to where they are now, more to the north.
And people got cut off. I mean, people like Malta is one of our episodes. Malta was joined to Sicily, which was joined to the toe of Italy during the Ice Age. It was all one continuous landmass. And then the sea levels rose and cut off these islands. And what I'm saying in the series is we're not paying enough attention to how the world looked during the Ice Age. There were times in the Ice Age when the Sahara Desert was green. Some of these ancient maps show lakes and rivers in the Sahara Desert. That's 9 million square kilometers, which has been hardly touched by archaeology. 27 million square kilometers, 10 million square miles of the best real estate on Earth. Those coastlines, those continental shelves flooded at the end of the Ice Age, hardly surveyed by archaeology. Yes, there's some marine archaeology, but they aren't looking for lost civilizations. They're looking for medieval shipwrecks. The Amazon rainforest, nearly 6 million square kilometers, still covered by dense canopy. Thank goodness at least that much of it is left. Again, so little of the Amazon has been surveyed by archaeology, but recent investigations are showing huge geometrical structures emerging from underneath the cover of the rainforest. So what I'm saying is archaeologists should not be so certain about their picture of the past that they can absolutely rule out the possibility of a lost civilization of the Ice Age, because archaeologists haven't done enough work yet. Come back to me when you've completely surveyed the Sahara, when you surveyed the flooded continental shelves. When you surveyed the Amazon rainforest, come back then and tell me that there's no possibility of a lost civilization of the Ice Age. But until you've done that, I think at least it's worth listening to other points of view. It's
quite amazing. It really is. GrahamHancock.com is his website. See his series on Netflix right now, Ancient Apocalypse. He's the creator, and I can't wait to watch it. I have not watched it yet, but I can't wait to go and do that. If I understand you correctly, my people on my father's side, he came from Bari, Italy, which is the heel of the boot. If I follow what you're saying, the toe of the boot, as you look at Italy, was connected to Sicily, and it's not now because of the rising water. It's not because the land mass moved. It's because you've got more water than we used to have. Do I get you right?
Exactly. You take me exactly right. Those huge ice caps on top of North America and Northern Europe and elsewhere, they melted down, leaving the topography that we see today. All that water went into the world ocean, and it raised the level of the world ocean from the peak of the ice age until 11,600 roughly years ago. It raised it by 400 feet. So, we're missing a huge part of the Earth's surface. And we cannot rule out the possibility of a lost civilization until we've thoroughly investigated that part. I personally spent 7 years scuba diving all over the world, wrote a book about it published in 2002 called Underworld.
Amazing.
Followed up tips from fishermen and local divers about structures that they'd found underwater. And we found extraordinary structures underwater, which clearly had been built when they were above water and were covered by rising sea levels. And that's just one person with a minimal budget doing what investigation I could. If serious money were put into this, goodness knows what we'd find.
Well, hopefully that's going to happen now since your series is out. Go see it at Ancient Apocalypse. One last question, and Graham, promise me you'll come back again. This is so intriguing to me. I'd love to learn even more from you. Will you do that?
I'd be delighted to come back, Joe.
Okay, let me ask you one last question. Do we have any evidence of what language was 11, 12,000 years ago on planet Earth? Do we know how people were communicating? Is there anything on stones? You said that there were old maps that were falling apart that were utilized as a guide. What was the language? Do we know?
We cannot say what spoken language was in use or how many spoken languages there were. In New Guinea and in some parts of the Amazon, there are literally hundreds of languages spoken by isolated communities. But what we can say for sure is that people did speak a language and that it was as sophisticated and as capable of expressing complex ideas as our language today.
Wow.
And they created great art and they created great architecture. These were people, men and women, just like ourselves, with abilities just like our own. One of the puzzles is that anatomically modern human beings have been around for 300,000 years. Why did we wait until just 6,000 years ago to start the first civilizations? That's one of the problems I'm addressing in this investigation.
It's a great question, and that's why you're a journalist and you go ahead and try to figure it out. I can't wait to see this Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix. How many parts in the series?
8 parts, and each one's about half an hour.
Beautiful. I can't wait to go and watch it. I'll probably binge it this weekend, to be honest. It's Graham Hancock. Go to grahamhancock.com. Ingest everything that he does. I love that you spelled it out. I love that you're skeptical, and I love that the facts, made you draw these conclusions, not somebody telling you what. Well, this is the story that we have to tell, Graham, so you have to follow what we say. I love that you fly in the face of people attacking you, because that means that we're getting something that you worked hard for and that I believe to certainly be the truth. Graham, thanks a million for coming on. Let's do it again soon, can we?
My pleasure. Look forward to talking to you again.
All right, brother. We appreciate you. We're back after this. Stay right here.